Good morning, blog viewers. We will start today's post in the morning because I think we've had some lighting issues at night that have been impeding viewability. And again, our focus here on the blog is to try to remove any of the distractions that would impede upon the communicability of the ideas and the expression of the ideas, and anything that enhances the expression of the ideas and the communicability it would be very welcome. So any further feedback anyone has would be greatly helpful in that regard. Today we're going to talk about the problem of boredom in modern society, modern, I would say modern, probably modern capitalist advanced economies, although boredom obviously has been a problem throughout the world at some time or another. But the issue, the type of boredom we're talking about here, and first of all, we're going to put this in the good of passion, because at some fundamental level, boredom is the lack of passion for things, the lack of caring about things deeply, the lack of finding sort of excitement and tingle in what one is going for in life, or seeing life itself as having any of those things. And it is a huge problem, and it causes a lot of other problems. Various thinkers have said over the years that boredom is perhaps the cause of all evil, or that it's obviously it can prevent man from developing, which I think is probably the key point. That if you're bored, you're not engaged, you're not exercising all your different faculties, you're not perfecting yourself to the best that you're able, but you're sort of limited in that sense. So we'll put this in passion, and obviously boredom is a lack of passion. So overcoming boredom and finding ways to fight boredom would be a way to have a more passionate, meaningful life. And of course, we've not been alone in noticing that boredom is a problem in the modern age. There's a guy by the name of Sean Desmond Healy wrote a book in about 1984, which I have not read, but I intend to read. It's called Boredom, Self, and Culture. And in the book, Healy sort of had, his main thesis is that boredom had been sort of a rare, isolated phenomena before, or perhaps not diagnosed as boredom or thought of as boredom about 3 centuries ago, but has now grown in severity and intensity, hounding all peoples, but particularly Western culture at large. And we should think about maybe why that is so. Why has boredom now become a problem, or more of a problem than it used to be? And I think part of it is that we've had our basic needs taken care of more easily in modern societies, and once those basic needs are taken care of, that people have to move on to other things. And if they're not finding the excitement in the other things, they're going to feel bored. And so that might be one of the reasons. There's probably many reasons, and some of them we'll talk about today. But at root, boredom does seem to be a fairly big problem of modern times. The type of boredom we're talking about today, we're going to focus on, is not sort of the boredom of waiting in a line in a drive-through and being bored, or being bored with for a day or two. But it's more systemic. It's more of a boredom with basically society's, or the culture that one's in, the sort of the dominant objects of pursuit, the things that most people are going for, the things that they value. You don't find meaning in them, or you don't find value in them. You don't find excitement in those things. It's also about finding boredom in generally the social and political discourse of the day, the things that people are talking about. If you pick up the newspaper, or you watch the news and you find a lot of the things boring, that would be sort of more what we're talking about. And if you find those things boring over the course of many months and years, not just a day or two. And also boredom with respect to the recreational activities people are engaged in. So if you find many of the things that people are doing around you boring in terms of how they spend their free time, those types of things, recreational activities, social political discourse, the dominant objects of pursuit, once someone or a group of people just doesn't find much excitement in those things, that would be sort of an instance where we're talking about boredom on a larger scale. And I think part of it was, I think in one of the earlier posts, I quoted William James in one of his talks, and one of his ideas was that wherever someone finds meaning in life and excitement and tingle and the spark of life, that's where the person finds meaning. And boredom is a problem where someone finds none of that in any aspect of their life. Of course, one can, continue to plod through life and just continue going through one's duties and responsibilities, trying to meet goals that even though one doesn't find much excitement in them or value, you're still going for those things. So all of that's possible. You can be, quote, or in a certain way plodding through life while you still don't find the plodding itself very exciting. And you may not even know you're bored. That's another sort of thing that we have to think about. You may be going along, just plodding through, maybe somewhat unhappy or somewhat dissatisfied, but you don't necessarily feel bored. Though in fact you may be bored, and that might be causing some of the disappointment and the frustrations you're having in your life. Is you're not seeing it as boredom, you're experiencing it as other things, but it could still be boredom. So we're going to talk about boredom today in the context of Stendahl's novel, The Red and the Black, which we talked about, I think, about a couple months ago, and I will try to link that prior. If you actually click on Stendahl on the categories, you'll see the prior post. And the novel is, just to give you a short summary, it's about, it's really the trials and tribulations of young Julien Sorel. And Julien was born in the novel set in 19th century France. And Julien is born in sort of a humble family. His father is a woodcutter. He's very intellectual, and he doesn't want to be a woodcutter. His father detests the books that he's reading, doesn't want him to be an intellectual, wants him just to be working as a woodcutter. But Julien sort of progresses in his educational studies. He's very proficient in Latin, and he knows the Bible very well. So he gathers a lot of academic awards, and he's sent to live with a well-to-do family in a nearby city. And he then the family he falls in love with I think a 30-year-old the wife of the mayor of the city, and they have an affair. After that affair, he leaves the family, and he goes to the seminary. He tries to become a priest for a while. Doesn't find that very interesting, and then he is sent to another well-to-do family, and again falls in love with the daughter of a very wealthy businessman, hotel owner in the second family that he's sent to, and the second woman that he falls in love with is a young lady by the name of Matilde, and she's about 20. Julien is about 21, I think. And then he falls in love with her, but he, through various ways, he tries to seduce her, and ultimately does. So, and I'm not completely finished with the work, but close to probably about 4/5 done. So that's sort of in a nutshell. It's most of the novel, and that's why the plot is sort of not as important as sort of what's happening psychologically. Stendahl was widely praised for his psychological penetration of different characters and their psyches, and definitely one of the issues that he focuses on over and over again in the novel is the problem of boredom for the various characters. And in many ways, he casts almost every character as struggling with boredom in a very, and not the boredom of a day or a couple hours, but more of a systemic boredom. And I want to focus first of all to start structure this is what is it? What kind of boredom does Stendahl discuss? What is his account of boredom in these characters? What is it that causes these people to perhaps be bored? What can we see as the causes? And perhaps the last question is, what would a life look like for these characters in which there is no boredom, in which boredom is defeated? And is that even a desirable thing? We tend to think always as boredom is negative, but I think certainly the novel, one of its big contributions is that the fight against boredom may not necessarily, if not done in the right ways, can also cause its own problems. So, starting with sort of the problem of boredom that Stendahl discusses, it's literally throughout the novel. The first quote I put in the in the bracketed quotes is a quote from Nancy Wheeler, and in her essay Stendahl's View of the System, I think she pretty much characterizes it really well. I'm just going to read this quote here. The system, by its rules, designed to maintain the status quo and prohibit progressive thought and discussion, stifles all but trivial and pleasant social conversation. The ensuing boredom tends to further entrench the system as the members of that society unconsciously realize that it is their only means of keeping their position. With each turn of the wheel, the social system becomes more firmly established, yet more of a burden. It becomes harder and harder to change the system and easier to play its game, though at the expense of individual merit and identity. And so Wheeler sort of identifies this sort of wheel image that, the wheel is turning, the social system is getting more firmly established with each turn. The turning itself is boring to the individual members, but they still have to participate in this because of fear of losing their position. And as each time it turns, it becomes harder and harder to change the system on the one hand because it's getting more entrenched, but as it's turning, it's also becoming easier to play the game because you've had more circles on this wheel in which you're only engaging in a trivial and pleasant conversation. Each time you engage in that kind of conversation, again, it becomes easier to do, harder to change. And that's certainly the theme of boring conversation is something that Stendahl talks about. There in the hotel that Julianne, the second family that he lives with, he's hired to be the sort of the bookkeeper or correspondent for the hotel owner, the dad, Marquis de la Mole, who is the father of Matilde, who he falls in love with. He spends a lot of time in what's called the drawing rooms of that hotel, and he talks about the conversations he hears there. And in a sort of very memorable passage, he writes, despite good tone, perfect manners, and the desire to be agreeable, boredom was written upon every brow. The young men who came to pay their respects, afraid to speak of anything that might lead to their being suspected of thinking, afraid to reveal some forbidden reading, became silent after a few elegantly phrased sentences on Rossini and the weather. So the conversations that are talked about in the drawing room are ones where everyone is bored. No one is sort of immune from this. He says boredom is written upon every brow. It's just clear. It may not be, no one's obviously acknowledging it, but if you look at people, you can see the boredom there. And he says, it's mainly because people are afraid to speak. And they're afraid to say anything that reveals any sort of original thought or thinking. Why? Because it could damage them. It could damage their perception and reputation among others. So everyone just sort of sticks to talking about things that are very neutral, things that are very unlikely to cause any sort of harsh reaction, things like the weather, the opera, things of that sort. He goes on and says, all through the evening you had ices or tea every quarter of an hour, and at midnight a sort of supper with champagne. It was for this reason that Julien sometimes remained to the end. Otherwise he failed to understand how anyone could listen seriously to the ordinary conversation of this drawing room, so magnificently gilded. Now and again he would watch the speakers to see whether they themselves were not laughing at what they were saying. My M. de Maistre, whom I knew by heart, has said things 100 times better, he thought, and even he is extremely boring. So So the problem of the conversation is Julien is listening to this conversation. He's incredibly bored. He's staying around just for the champagne and tea and food on offer, but otherwise he can't bear it. In fact, after this scene, he asks to be relieved of being asked to stay in these drawing rooms, but he's told that it's an honor for him to stay there, so he doesn't leave. And again, so later on in the novel, again, Stendahl comes back to this thought that the problem with the drawing rooms and the conversation is that their original thought is not rewarded or encouraged. He says, but they hate thought in your drawing rooms. It must never rise above the level of a comic song. Then it is rewarded. But the man who thinks, if he shows energy and novelty, you call a cynic. So again, this sort of leveling down of discourse to something that sort of a level of humor or comedy that's rewarded, but that anything above that is sort of is not encouraged and is not taken with any sort of admiration or there's no reward for any sort of originality and thought in any of these places. And so that's sort of the description that Stendahl gives us. He says later that the type of boredom he's talking about is one that people have no passions. There's an epithet in one of his chapters which says, sacrificing oneself to one's passions is one thing, but the passions that one doesn't have, oh sad 19th century. So again, this image of people floating around without passions at all. He says later, the boredom of a mode of life whose sole ambition was to create an effect on the public, without there being at the bottom of her heart any real enjoyment of this kind of success, had become intolerable. So it's, even if people have ambitions or if they have goals, as we talked about before, they're plodding through life, bottom is not something that they have any real enjoyment for. It's not anything that they want. It's something that they sort of have, they don't see a better option. They're going through it, but it's not, even their ambitions are in that sense not something that are grand or anything that they earnestly want. So that is, I think, the problem of boredom that Stendahl depicts in his various characters. Now, what causes, I guess the second question is, of course, as so much of, as we've talked about in the philosophical points, so much of perception is your perception of the world. One person may find something incredibly boring, another person may find it incredibly engaging and interesting. I think the very powerful argument we got in Pascal is Pense's that that from the side that we're viewing things, we're not erring from that side because our perceptions of our senses are always true. So there's a perspective out there that would regard these sets of activities as boring. There's another perspective that would find incredible meaning and excitement in those activities. So why is it that these characters in the novel, I guess the question would be, why would we could take it to our own lives and in terms of how is it that we find certain things boring, and what are the sort of the characteristics of us, or maybe the characters in the novel, that lead to regarding something as boring. And I think we get some answers through principally Julien's character and Mathilde, of why, because they both find everything, basically a lot of things around them incredibly boring. Julien, of course, we've gone through his reaction to the drawing rooms, very extreme, very heightened level of boredom. And Mathilde, who is sort of being pursued for marriage by many men. She constantly regards the people that are going after her and seeking her hand as very boring. And we get some reasons why. One thing, one core attribute is that they both they have a sense of self-importance, excessive sensitivity to the environment, unrealistic expectations, and sort of an intelligence that's not motivated by necessarily a good, loving will. You see that throughout both characters. And I'll just repeat that. Sense of self-importance is one thing. Excessive sensitivity, unrealistic expectations of what's going on around them, and an intelligence that's not motivated by a goodwill. And you see that in Julien first. He says that at one point he says one of the characteristics of genius is not to let its thoughts move in the rut traced by the common herd. So he views, in some sense, he views himself. Of course, he's a very complicated character, and sometimes he criticizes himself. But in many ways, he views himself as above the common lot or above the mass of people. And he says again, one of the characteristics of genius is not to let its thoughts move in the rut traced by the common herd. He's later described by Stendahl as someone whose imagination is always working to criticize life. And Stendahl says that this is sort of an error that stamps a superior person. That is, he's constantly looking to criticize rather than appreciate life. Stendahl says elsewhere, in bold and proud natures, it is only a step from anger with oneself to fury with other people. So one could be transferring one's own anger with oneself to sort of society in general and finding everything and deeming it boring and criticizing it. Julien is, described throughout the novel as sort of unhappy in many instances, unhappy with the whole of society. At some point, he's described in that way, who hates everything, and not just is not angered by a few things, but he finds everything sort of unappealing. He's later described as someone that even for a joke, even that for something that's funny, he needs it to be founded on some sort of rational, reasonable principle. And most things aren't. Most types of jokes aren't founded on that. So he's further angered by that. He's described as very sensitive and subject to many mood shifts. And that seems to play a part in his regarding things as boring. With Matilde, there's a sense of self-importance to her. She's definitely very proud of her position. She's wealthy. She's rather attractive. She's being pursued by many men, and she was also pampered when she was young. And Stendahl says that because of her birth, her fortune, all this pampering had later caused her to experience boredom because life never sort of measured up to all the things that she was promised. She was promised that she'd be happier than everyone else and more privileged, and life just didn't seem to catch up. The dreams she had, that she were told by other people that the type of life she'd live just didn't match up with the reality. And once that happens, she found things boring. So that's one set of issues that causes the characters to feel boredom. Another is a lack of empathy and connection with other people. Matilde often finds the different remarks made by the people that are pursuing her is very boring. But then she falls in love with, she finds, the speech is trivial, the subject's commonplace. But then after she falls in love with Julien and actually she feels drawn toward him, then she detects a charming grace in his most trivial actions. And that's very interesting because she went from, on the one hand, regarding triviality as boring in the suitors that she didn't like, but then when she fell in love with Julien, now she finds everything charming, not boring. So it could be a matter of perspective, boredom. It could be a matter of not having empathy with people, not caring about them, and as soon as you start to care about them, those same details that looked boring in that person or in that conversation now starts to take on a very different coloring. Not boring, but even charming. The trivial becomes charming, and I think there's definitely some truth to that in terms of how boredom works. Another cause of boredom, I think, that Stendahl identifies in the characters is sort of these absolute judgments of the world. Very sort of, I think that the term that philosophers sometimes use is sort of a Manichaean view of the world, where everyone is either a certain way or not. It's everyone is either greedy or not, or everyone is either selfish or not, and it's not really at all taking seriously that there's many gradations in between those two things. That these generalized judgments are frequently wrong, and not taking seriously all the complexity in people, and what distinguishes people from one another, across cultures, across nations, even across cities, across ages, different ages of one's life. But the characters here in the novel definitely have these very generalized judgments of everyone. Matilde, at some point, she says, how lifeless they seem. She's talking about the people that are pursuing her. Says, how lifeless they seem to me when compared with Julienne, all copies of each other. So everyone, she thinks, is a copy of each other, all the suitors. She later says that she lives in an age where, quote, all energy is dead. She thinks she can predict what the suitors are going to say to her, even before they've said anything to her, and what she's going to say in response. She says, she asks, what is the use of a love that makes one yawn? So again, she views love, she's already had a judgment of what love is without even experiencing it at that point. Julien, for his part, he gets letters from a rival lover, not Matilde, but another character that falls in love with him, and he starts to read the letters, but he only reads the first couple pages. First couple lines and the last couple lines, and these letters are usually 5-6 pages. He reads them and thinks they're boring. He gets bored immediately and doesn't read the rest. So he's not looking carefully enough. Again, so these quick judgments, absolute judgments, and he continues to receive letters from this lover, but he doesn't read any of them. He just throws them in the drawer without even reading. So in that sense, boredom is again shown by Stendahl to be perhaps a fault of not looking carefully enough at people, not judging things with care, stopping very quickly at a couple lines and moving beyond that, and that can also be the cause of boredom. And Julien, for his part, also has a lot of these very absolute judgments of the world, and when he moves to Paris, he sees nothing but affectation and fakeness, inauthenticity in every woman, in every lady he sees in Paris. He says, exactly, he says, I saw nothing but affectation in all the women of Paris. And then again, interestingly, once he gets to know Matilde a little bit, first he regards her as haughty and cold and sort of like everyone else, but once he begins to walk with her in the garden, once he begins to know her a little bit more deeply, he finds her more interesting, learned, and rational. So his judgments of boredom and sort of these absolute judgments wipe away as soon as he gets to know the person, spends more time and starts looking deeper, and moves beyond sort of these absolute judgments of the world. Another category of or cause of boredom in the novel is self-deception. The characters are deeming other people boring when in fact one could say that their own actions are highly boring themselves. Julien, for example, when he tries to, at some point, he tries to get Matilde to love him by sort of pursuing this other rival lover, and he starts writing out letters that he's given, love letters that he's gotten from someone else, 53 of them, and he starts just copying them, word for word. And here's again, Julien was a character that blamed or was shocked earlier at the boredom of the conversation in the drawing rooms, found it so rote and uninteresting. And here he is just scribbling out these love letters that he hadn't wrote himself. He's literally copying them word for word. He says at one point that he regarded the letters as deadly dull, stuffed with phrases about virtue. He fell asleep while he was copying one of them, and he sends 53 of these letters. Every one he thinks is more boring than the next. At some point, he doesn't even start reading them line for line. He just starts copying them without any thought of their meaning. He fails to catch at some point that the cities that are talked about in one of the letters have no relationship to the cities that he's been in, and he sends the letter anyway, and the rival lover picks up on this, and he of course has an excuse, but he's not at all catching what he's doing here. So I think the point Stendahl is making is that Julian, while criticizing other people being boring, is himself boring. And you see this again when he tries to woo Matilde by not revealing his emotions, just sort of hiding how he feels. And he says that the quote Russian wisdom that to say little and do little is the only way of salvation is very wise. Again, so for someone that had criticized other people for being boring, for saying little, doing common things, he's doing exactly the same thing. He falls in love with Matilde not because of any, just Julienne again, not because of any great thing in her character, some sort of special genius she had, or some sort of genuine love. But he falls in love with her mainly because of her beauty. And Stendahl makes this point pretty clear. He says, he hadn't known her character long enough to have fallen in love with her, but what he was taken in by was her beauty, her admirable style and dress, and her regal manner. So again, for a character that seemed to be so criticizing and condescending of other people's boring habits or boring traits, to fall in love with someone over those kinds of things, many could describe Julian's own actions as being very boring in that sense. But of course, he lacks in many instances, he lacks the sort of critical self-reflection to notice that he's prey to the same problems of boredom and boring attitudes and boring decisions. But he doesn't see it. So he doesn't see it and doesn't correct the behavior. In general, both of these characters, Matilde and Julienne, who criticize others as boring, ultimately Stendahl describes their relationship and their wooing of each other as a love that was sort of is one where both characters were sort of imitating what they thought was the right way to love, but it wasn't a reality wasn't a love that was being generated from internal sort of passion that was causing them to love. It was just they were looking at, or in their mind they had an idea of what was the right way to love, and they tried to copy that. Again, more examples of this issue. So these are some of the reasons, I think, many of them not very endearing as to why someone could regard a whole society or a whole way of life as boring. And a lot of, I think what Stendahl is saying here is, while some of it is, no doubt, there is, boredom in some of the conversations, or maybe the same repetitive things are being talked about, not very complex or intellectual, but that perhaps a lot of the reason why these characters are regarding these things as boring is problems in their own character. It's not society. Society doesn't have, I think, a duty, we could say, to make anyone's life interesting, to make anyone's life meaningful. Society doesn't have that duty, but the individual has the duty to ensure that he finds meaning in the life that's presented. And I think both of these characters in significant areas of the novel, portions of the novel, they fail in that responsibility. They want society to present them with the exciting, meaningful life. And in fact, I think Stendahl's point might be that you have to create that life yourself. There certainly is enough out there, or should be enough out there, if you look hard enough to find excitement and meaning. But the sort of the personality traits they have are preventing them from getting to that point. They're resting more in just criticizing the society as boring rather than doing anything to fix it or to create a less boring world for themselves and others. And I think that is probably one of the most profound insights that you get out of the novel. You start reading it first. You read the novel, and there's this knee-jerk reaction to find some level of humor and delight and how Stendahl is describing these drawing rooms, and to be taken in by his language and Wheeler's language as well, about this wheel that's turning and everything being so boring. But when you look a little deeper, as I think Stendahl always encourages readers to look deeper, he wrote that his novels were for the happy few that really engaged his novels and tried to understand them. But anyway, when you look deeper, you may want to move beyond sort of that knee-jerk reaction to say, everything is boring and the society is boring and, the things talked about are boring, and to look more at your own character and see what it is that you could do to find less boredom. So that's one point. Another key idea that comes out boredom in the novel is that perhaps even a life where boredom is eliminated, where boredom is viewed as sort of, again, a mortal enemy of sorts that is supposed to be fought, that might not be an appealing life either. That maybe there is some level of boredom that we should accept in our lives, and that this effect, that the attempt to squeeze out all boredom from life is dangerous, and is not even an appealing life or a good life. You see this, I think, in Julien. He at some point he takes a walk with Matilda in the garden, and she starts talking about all her lovers, all the people she loved in the past. And you would think, okay, that's not boring. That's a pretty shocking, non-boring way of handling yourself on a date or a stroll with a romantic partner. And Julian's devastated. He says no words can express. Stendahl says no words could express Julian's anguish, and understandably. So I think in some cases, you may want a life that's not boring, but when you see what that is, it may be worse than the life of boredom, because it can be very painful, depending on what happens. And of course, Matilda, for her own part, she wants a love that's not boring. She constantly makes that point about the other suitors. She wants a love that's heroic, where everything is left to chance. She says, what characterizes great passion is, quote, an immense difficulty to be overcome and the black uncertainty of events. There's another point in the novel where I think Stendahl says there's a type of character that can fight boredom only by having his whole life exposed, his whole life in the balance at every point. Everything, every day is putting it all on red. Putting everything and taking huge existential risks with one's life, huge destructive decisions, and welcoming that. You see that in Matilda. She wants things to be left to chance. She wants difficulty in her relationships, the black uncertainty of events. All of this she views as sort of an effect to a way out of the boredom. But we need to question whether boredom is even better than this kind of destructive decision making, where everything is left to chance, where we want non-boring speech, but then we get the kind of speech that Matilda starts talking about her other lovers. So be careful what you wish for, I think, is certainly another thought that we see of Stendahl with his really masterful description of boredom and its problems, and perhaps its inevitability in life is a good thing. And I'll see this point more traced throughout the novel is that when Julien, when the various characters try not to be boring, their speech and their whole behavior becomes very false and exaggerated. So the deliberate attempt to avoid boredom in life can cause you to become dishonest, can cause you to become very almost buffoon-like, can cause you to become incredibly, inauthentic in some ways, knowingly inauthentic and false, and but all in an attempt to be interesting or non-boring. So there's a section where Julian is speaking to Matilde, and he says, Stendahl says he was fully aware that what he was saying seemed absurd to Matilde, but he sought to impress her by the elegance of his diction. The falser things I say, the more I ought to appeal to her. He must above all avoid any simple or reasonable idea. So clearly in his description of Julian and his attempt to woo Matilde, he makes it very obvious that if you fight boredom in the way that Julian is trying to do, you're very quickly going to be landing into absurdities. You're going to be landing in falsities. You're going to be impressing solely through elegance rather than merit or substance. That you're going to be making, and you're going to be continually doing this and saying falser and falser things, absurder and absurder things, just to avoid the perception that you're boring, that you're simple, or that you're reasonable. And this sort of has this perversity that there's no end to it. Julian goes on, and at one point he praises a ballet he's seen, and he does so only because he thinks it's dull. He thinks it's dull, but he does it anyway to not be bored with it. So again, the falsity of the attempt to escape boredom. The characters in the novel often know that his speech is false, but they're still impressed by it. And so it's not just the speaker, but it's the people receiving it. They know something is exaggerated, but in the attempt to avoid boredom, they welcome it anyway. So Matilde, she sees Julian talking to the rival lover at one point, and knows that everything he's saying is just totally a lie. She's listening to it, and none of it's true. But yet, after listening to it, she's sort of impressed again by him. She's impressed by his heroicness, or however she thought of it in her mind. Throughout, I think you can say pretty clearly that is one thing that Stendahl is drawing, this contrast between sort of simple speech and action, simple reasonable speech that may be boring to some people or regarded as boring, and on the other hand, the characters that try to escape that through these kinds of mechanisms, or that one way to escape that may not be so appealing because it relies so much on exaggeration and lies and inauthenticity, which is not good for people either. One last example of that is Julian, the love letters that he receives from the rival lover. He regards them as fantastic, so they're not boring. But then he starts to they are actually boring, but they're boring because the lover has tried to be fantastic, but has only now become very vague, expressing everything and nothing at the same time. It's sort of had this hyper sublimity to it in an effect, or hyper artificiality to it in an effect to avoid boredom, but still it's not. It's become just fantastic and meaningless because it's ventured so far from the level of anything organic, real. So I think the novel is really a very interesting reflection on boredom. I want to conclude this by sort of showing I want to draw attention to the picture I'm going to post on the post today, and it's in downtown LA. It's this these cars that are sort of placed at various points on a semicircle, and the car on the bottom, just by the bottom point, so it's as it should be. But then the various cars on the side, they are sort of on the sides and sort of in precarious positions. you think they're falling down a hill or on top of, about to go onto another car. And I think we could think of boredom in that sense, that perhaps the initial car, the car at the bottom, may be in the most boring position, but it's also in the securest. And there's sort of it's most grounded to reality too. It's closest to the ground, and the attempt to escape from boredom in some ways can take one to these other extreme positions where these other cars are, and also losing further and further contact from reality. They're further elevated up from reality, whereas the original car was very close to reality, and that's always in fighting boredom. That might be an image we may want to keep in mind as to the right way to fight boredom, and not succumb to some of the things that we saw in the novel. And I think that Stendahl does a great job of showing everything involved in boredom, the problems of it in the drawing rooms, and the characteristics of people, perhaps, that would accentuate evaluations or regarding things as boring, and showing that might be hiding deep problems in the own person. That's for doing the evaluation, and then some of the approaches to escaping from boredom and the problems there as well. So it's a very complicated situation, and boredom should not be viewed, I think, at least as once we get out of this novel, not be viewed as an easy problem at all. It's a very difficult problem, and the solutions that seem at first glance the most easy do not seem also in many ways attractive. So we'll continue with some other works, and I hope everyone has a good day. Bye-bye.